All right, so go ahead and open up your Bibles to Joshua chapter 11. That's where we're going to get started here. It's kind of a two-part lesson as we move through tonight. So first we're going to cover really what's just in chapter 11, and then we're going to move on to chapters 12 through 22, which are really just a mapping of the land once it's been fully conquered. So let's go ahead and start out with part one of our lesson, which is going to be the Northern Campaign. Colton gave us a lesson over the Southern Campaign last week, and we want to start with just a quick recap of that because it gives us context as to where the scripture picks up at the beginning of chapter 11. So just a few quick bullets is there's the miraculous defeat of the 5 Amorite kings at Gibeon, and then the Israelites continue to move through the south and conquer the various cities before removing themselves back up north to their camp at Gilgal, which is kind of in the central portion of the land of Canaan. So just to give you another visual of where that is, so starting at Gibeon, they kind of follow the arrowed line, making their way down and then back up to Gilgal on the northeast side of the map there. So let's go ahead and start out with verse 1 of chapter 11. So if you want to read along in your Bible, that's great. The text will be on the screen for us as well. So please follow along with me here. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Akshaph, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah, south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, and in Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah. Continuing on to verse 4, they came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army as numerous as the sand of the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. So in comparison to the Southern Campaign, which was really the Israelites moving through the land, kind of wiping the various cities out, a lot of the legwork was done for them in this case. Basically, the king of Hazor asked all of the kings of these various cities here to kind of collapse on his position. The Israelites then moved to that point in order to battle them. So we can see where Hazor is, kind of just to the northwest of the Sea of Galilee there, and the other Canaanite kings coming with their armies from the south and north to meet there to consolidate for battle. So moving on to verse 6, the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them slain over to Israel. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed, and he burned Hazor itself. So a little bit about the chariots and horses. We've seen this referenced of the hamstringing horses a few times here. And to give you a little bit of context of the significance and symbolism of why the emphasis of chariots and horses is, it's obviously we know they were used in military tactics, but it goes beyond just the use within the military societies of the time. Of course, they were the equivalent of kind of tanks that we have today. They were the mobile way to quickly move a force, deadly fast. You could attack from the chariot and of course, deal horrible damage. But they also symbolize national strength. Of course, if your army had more chariots or horses than the opposing army, you were probably going to expect that you were going to beat them. So that was definitely a large component. But it also moves into the religious aspect of the Canaanites and other ancient religions of the time. They were a huge symbolic part of those religions, heavily linked to sun worship. Often believed that chariots, carried gods across the skies. We've probably seen imagery and different reliefs in museums or whatnot that might illustrate that. as well as they were used by earthly kings to portray themselves as divine or godlike. They roll into town on a chariot on horseback. So eliminating the chariots, eliminating the horses of the enemy kind of eliminates that pagan religious aspect as well. The quick note on the hamstringing of horses, that's literally cutting the horse's legs so that they can't be used in battle. So it's going to prevent that horse from running and being used to attack the Israelites in this case. We see more illustrations of this chariot and horse destruction in 2 Kings. So in 2 Kings 23:11, King Josiah, who's reigning at the time, removed from the entrance to the temple of the Lord the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan Melech. Josiah burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. So just another biblical illustration of this chariots and sun thing and the horses and why they get destroyed in this case. So beyond just the military, but the religious aspect as well. So where Hazor is, kind of just to the northwest of the Sea of Galilee, is a pretty well-established archaeological site, Tel Hazor. So as we know from our past lessons going all the way back to Jericho in chapter 2, we know that a tell is sort of a hill that a city is built on top of, so a fortified city usually with some walls around it. You can kind of tell this is a pretty good picture. If you look at the kind of upper left section, you can see the relief that the land has going from the top of the hill down to it underneath. And just a few more pictures of some ruins of this site. So this was the site of an ancient temple, a pagan temple in Hazor, and then these were pillars of a great house in Hazor. So a very well-established site in present-day Israel. So let's get back to verse 12 here. Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds, except Hazor, which Joshua burned. The Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities, but all the people they put to the sword until they completely destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. So Joshua took this entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, from Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir, to Baal Gad, in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and put them to death. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time, except for the Hivites living in Gibeon. Not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So let's look at a comparison between chapters 10 and 11. I don't know if anybody's picked up on this. As I was going through and studying what's happening here in the northern campaign in comparison to what happens in the southern campaign in chapter 10, there are some stark similarities, which I wanted to cover with everyone because I think they're pretty interesting, and it's this pattern. So we're going to kind of follow the line here as we build it out. The first is the leader of the enemy hears of the threat of the Israelites. Obviously, the Israelites have wiped out Jericho. Word spreads as they continue to move through, annihilate these various cities, Ai, and so forth. Word spreads. And so these enemies here, the kings here, and they're afraid of the Israelites. So they send out a call to all the kings of the region that are underneath the king of Hazor in this case, and he calls for aid from these local kings to come support the army, fight against the Israelites, and the local kings mobilize. They move their troops, they get their armies ready, they send all their chariots and horses and swordsmen up there, and they camp at the battleground waiting for the Israelites. Joshua then gets a promise from God, as we read through the narrative, that he's going to provide assistance, that the enemy is going to be delivered into the hands of the Israelites, and then the Israelite army moves to the battleground to prepare for war. Cut off a little bit of our text here, but the Israelites defeat the army and chase the survivors away. So they beat the opposing army. There are a few people that survive the initial battle. They scatter, flee back to their cities, flee into the wilderness, so forth and so on. And the Israelites chase after those people and they wipe them out as well. Again, we get a summary of the towns and the cities and whatnot that are destroyed and the territories that have been conquered. And then lastly, we get a recognition of God's influence. This is a mirror of exactly what happens in chapter 10 as we read it here in chapter 11. I mean, we can go almost verse by verse. So just to hit on a few verses here that follow this pattern. In chapter 10, we get King Adonai-Zedek calling to the other kings. He's afraid of the Israelites. He's heard of the threat. We get the same thing here in chapter 11. King Jabin hears this. He calls for aid. He sends a message out to the various troops of the other kings in the region, and they mobilize. They send their troops. They hear of the Israelites. They hear the message, and all these kings gather their troops, and they send them as aid. So here in chapter 11, they come up with all their troops, all their horses, all their chariots, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Obviously, that's not the case. Did a little bit of weird research. There's like supposedly 7 quintillion grains of sand in the world. No way there's that many people, of course, there, but it's to illustrate that there was just a very large army amassing here, one that would probably be expected to win, but of course they don't have God on their side. The enemy armies camp at the battleground. So originally they camp at Gibeon in the southern campaign. Here they camp at the waters of Merom in preparation for the battle with the Israelites to ensue. And then Joshua gets his promise from God. In chapter 10, God says, do not fear, for I have handed them over to you. And then in chapter 11, we get, again, do not be afraid, by this time tomorrow, I'm going to hand all of them to you slain. So Joshua's going in this with full confidence, of course. The Israelite army moves to the battleground. So in chapter 10, Joshua goes up from Gilgal to Gibeon with his fighting force. And then in chapter 11, Joshua and the whole army came up to the waters of Merom from Gilgal. And then the Israelites then chased the survivors away. So after the battle, the Israelites, they defeated the enemy, but these people have fled, trying to survive. In chapter 10, they slaughter them, as far as Beth Horon, and then in chapter 11, they pursued them to Greater Sidon, Mesrephath Maim, and there are several others listed in the full text there. The Israelites destroy them. So after they've run away, then we get a summary of the towns that have been conquered, territories defeated, Makkedah and Libnah, all the way from Goshen to Gibeon in chapter 10. And then in chapter 11, Hazor and the northern kings are defeated, Arabah, Balgad to the Anakites and the hill countries. Basically just kind of describing that it's this whole land. And then there's the recognition of God's influence. So all of the kings have been defeated and their lands handed over to Joshua because the Lord God fought for Israel in chapter 10. And then we get that Joshua did nothing other than what God commanded. So everything that God commanded Moses, Joshua did that in fulfillment of God's command. We see that in 11:15 and 11:23 there. So it's really this mirror. And the question you might ask is, why is there this narrative structure that's the exact same in chapter 11 versus chapter 10? And there's a few reasons, probably more here than I could even include. But the first is it's going to allow this history to orally be passed down. If we know the pattern of the story, thinking of the Israelites, they don't have written text as we do today. They don't have a Bible that they're carrying around with them. There are probably some scrolls, but not everybody can read. Most of it's going to get passed down orally, generation to generation to generation. And if you know the way the story goes, it's probably going to be easier to tell that story. So that's one reason. The second is it's going to confirm and reaffirm their faith and the victories that they have. It's a little propagandistic in a way, not in a negative way, but in a positive way to bolster the Israelites' faith that God was behind them, God supported this. And then lastly, it's going to obviously clearly communicate a threat to their enemies. Enemies that read these accounts or hear of these accounts are going to know, hey, God, the actual God was with these, they got defeated. Can our God hold up? They might be a little afraid. So the picture there with the arrow is pointing to the deeds of Tiglath-Pileser I. It's located in Britain's Enlightenment Museum. And it's really this similar text where you can kind of see just a mirror of the same narrative structure. The text might be a little small there on the screen, but it's an account of another king, similar time, about 1000 BC, recording his events multiple different battles in a very similar way. So overwhelming the enemy, that can be read in episode 9 and episode 19 of that prism. And the prism essentially is this cylindrical piece of stone that gets carved all the way around. Overwhelming the enemy, fighting a large enemy getting defeated, enemy corpses are dealt with, so on and so forth. So it's just a mirroring between these two stories. Again, exactly the way that we see it here between chapter 10 and chapter 11. So nothing unusual for the way that things are recorded at the time, but just an interesting note as to why we see this mirrored structure. That moves us into chapter 12. So I'll just throw a quick pause out there and ask if there are any questions or comments over chapter 11 before we get into the mapping of the new land. All right, so let's get into part 2 here then, mapping the promised land. So we'll start, of course, with chapter 12. We won't read each one of these chapters, obviously just for the sake of time, as well as if you have read through it in preparation or as part of your daily Bible reading, you'll know it can be a little bland as these geographical descriptions, but it starts in chapter 12 with a list of the kings that have been defeated. So there are 33 total kings noted here on the page. 2 are defeated by Moses before they cross the Jordan River. So the defeat of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, occur on the east side of the Jordan. Then the Israelites, of course, move into Jericho at the beginning of what is the southern campaign, essentially, before moving up to the north and defeating the kings as part of the northern campaign. And all total, Joshua defeated 31 of the 33 kings, all on the west side of the Jordan River. Moving into chapter 13, we first see that Joshua's old. So there's been some time passage. We're not sure exactly how much time has passed between this. It's kind of the first note we get of Joshua's age at any point during this portion of the book of Joshua. We note that there's still land to be taken over. As God says, God commands Joshua to go ahead and begin distributing this land, as the Israelites still have a few strongholds of Canaanites that they might need to take care of, but go ahead and start giving all of the tribes their inheritance of land. And we get a description of the land of the Reubenites and Gadites and Manasseh, which that goes back to Numbers 32, when those tribes asked for land on the east side of the Jordan River. So they saw that the land would be good for their livestock. They asked if they could have it. And Joshua, Moses basically go, yep, you can have it, but you have to fight for us. So, we're going to hold you to your oath. And here's kind of a warning of don't stay here, fulfill your oath and help us fight as we take the rest of the land on the west side of the Jordan River. Let's go ahead and go back there. And then the Levites, it's noted that the Levites get no inheritance. So kind of good quick point as before we get to the map that we're going to see 12 divisions of land, but there's not going to be one for the Levites here. So let's go ahead and look at the map. This is the land that the Israelites have conquered, kind of that big gray splotch there, stretching from the Mediterranean down to the Dead Sea, up to the north of the Sea of Galilee. And then let's go ahead and bring up this tracker of the list of tribe names. So we get Reuben all the way down through Benjamin. Those are listed in birth order, not necessarily the order that they're going to get land in. So just keep that in mind as we go through the tribe here. But let's go ahead and take care of Levi. They're not going to get any land, so we can kind of mark Levi off of our list here. Reuben, we know what land they got. It was just reviewed that they got land. Going all the way back into Numbers is when they got their portion. So we can see where Reuben appears there, kind of just to the east side of the Dead Sea, and we can get Reuben taken care of. Next is Gad. So Gad gets the land just north of Reuben. And then next is Manasseh, which kind of gets the largest splotch of land here, kind of stretching right across the middle of Canaan, from the Mediterranean all the way over to the wilderness on the east side. We get more detail about Manasseh's land later on in our chapters here, but we already know that they got their portion of land, so we can take care of them. In chapter 14 is really where it begins the division of the land west of the Jordan. So it starts with Caleb. Caleb asks for some land. He's been fighting for the Lord for a long time. He says he's just as vigorous to keep fighting in his old age as he ever was. And Joshua grants his request. And so he essentially just gets a city. So he's not getting a large tract of land like we see from the other tribes. He gets Hebron, which is kind of in that red box right there, if you're able to note where that is. In chapter 15 is where we start to see the first tribe get land on the west side of the Jordan River. And first up is Judah. They get the southernmost portion, which is going to kind of be this big, large area going down into the wilderness towards Egypt. So we can take care of Judah, and they're going to be off of our list. Ephraim, there's kind of a few different pronunciations for that one. We're going to use Ephraim. Then they receive land in chapter 16. So going back to our map here, Ephraim's kind of nestled right there underneath Manasseh, between Manasseh and Judah, with a little bit of land between Judah and where Ephraim is. And then that moves us into chapters 17 and 18. So in chapter 17, we get that long, detailed description of Manasseh's land. And Ephraim, they ask for a little bit more land. And Joshua basically tells them, hey, there's some extra land you can have going up into the forest, going up into the foothills. If you want it, go clear it out. It's yours. So they're on their way. It's not really noted beyond that whether or not they finished out that quest and got the rest of the land. We could probably assume that they did, but it's not really stated or covered anywhere else. And then in chapter 18, the 7 remaining tribes are still there. They haven't got their land yet. Joshua kind of calls them out and says, hey, why don't you have your land? Go map out the land, return back with reports on the maps of the land, and then we're going to cast lots and see who gets what portion of land. Kind of keeps this very unbiased nature to the divvying up of the land here. So the first lot that gets cast is Benjamin. So Benjamin, last there on our list, the youngest of the sons. Benjamin gets that little tiny portion right between Ephraim and Judah. And then that takes us to chapter 19. And this is where all the rest of the land gets divvied up right here. So we can see that they cast lots for all of the remaining land. And they go first up Simeon, next Zebulun, middle there Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and lastly Dan is the last tribe to get their land. So let's jump back to our map here and let's finish filling in all of these gray spaces that we see. So our first is Simeon. They get that portion that's completely enclosed inside of Judah there in the yellow section at the bottom. And then we get Zebulun, that little kind of northern piece coming up out of Manasseh. Issachar, that red section kind of right there underneath the Sea of Galilee. And then Asher going up kind of the northernmost against the Mediterranean Sea. Naphtali right next to them. And then our last little section here is Dan. But there's an 8th lot. Well, there's no more tribes. Joshua doesn't have any land yet. So Joshua gets given some land. Of course, he's been fighting this whole campaign. We don't really know exactly where his city was all too well, but it's in there somewhere, of course. So just some screenshots here of the map, kind of really enlarged so you can see it clearly where all the tribes fall. So we get Asher there. Tyre, of course, the city that we hear referenced many times throughout the Bible, falls within Asher. Naphtali, just to the east of that, sitting on top of the Sea of Galilee. And then we get Zebulun, Issachar, kind of right there, small ones right above Manasseh. And then Manasseh, kind of that big, large stretch containing most of the Jordan River. And then Dan, Ephraim, and Gad kind of stretching there across the central part. Benjamin, that little skinny one going east and west, just above Judah there. We can see that's where Jerusalem is, kind of just there in the southern portion of Benjamin. And then down in the southern portion of the land of Canaan, we have Judah, Reuben, and Simeon. We can kind of see Bethlehem noted right there at the top of the screen in Judah, sitting just to the west of the Dead Sea. This land was about the size of Alabama, so just to kind of give you some scale of how big of a land, a tract are we talking about, roughly the size of the state of Alabama, also about the size of England, if you have any concept of how large that is. That's how big we're talking about. And then we move into chapter 20. So all the land's passed out now. All the Israelites have their land. They're all going to settle their cities that they've conquered, establish their communities. And God says, hey, remember this command that I gave you in Numbers 35? Set up some cities of refuge. And so what is a city of refuge? It's kind of a foreign concept in our time. But there were 6 cities designated. We had 3 designated west of the Jordan, 3 designated east of the Jordan. And these cities were so that if someone accidentally killed someone, they could flee to this city and be protected. They couldn't be hurt or attacked by the person that they had wronged or that person's family. They would be safe as long as they remained in these cities. But if they went out into the wilderness or left the city walls, then the person that had been aggrieved could attack them. So in Numbers 35, 6 through 33, it's kind of a long portion, but I'm going to read verses 9 through 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns to be your cities of refuge to which a person who has killed someone accidentally may flee. They will be places of refuge from the avenger so that anyone accused of murder may not die before they stand trial before the assembly. This is a very foreign concept in our time. It's not something that we really encounter. We typically see the laws kind of black and white. You did something wrong, doesn't really matter where you go. You're responsible for it. You're subject to the laws of the land and the punishment that ensues. And more likely than not, the law is going to come track you down, and you're going to have to pay for what you did. Not so much here if someone accidentally kills someone. Of course, this doesn't account for murder, but in the case of an accidental manslaughter, the person could flee to one of these cities from wherever they were, get inside the city walls, and they would be safe. This is not a foreign concept throughout history. This is something that many historical and ancient societies have had. Ancient Greeks used their temples as kind of refuges and asylums. If you could get to the temple, you would be safe there. Medieval England, churches were used as asylum. You could seek asylum in a church for up to 40 days. Native American tribes had designated peace towns. And then you might be wondering, why do I have this picture of this tropical island? Obviously, there's no palm trees in Israel here. This is actually in Hawaii. So this is Pu'uhonua, which I've had the pleasure of visiting. Would highly recommend if you ever get the chance to go to the big island of Hawaii. This is the same thing in ancient Hawaiian culture. They had these kind of settlements, little huts with fences around them, essentially, that if you broke the laws of the land, you could run to the settlement, get inside its city walls, and you would be safe. So something that is not unique to the Israelites as far as ancient cultures go, having this cities of refuge practice, but something that's definitely strange to our time. If you're interested in sea turtles, would highly recommend going here. You can see them in great numbers in the tidal pools that happen at Pu'uhonua. So where are these cities? So west of the Jordan, we get Kadesh, Shechem, and Kiriath Arba, also known as Hebron. That's that city that Caleb got, if we go back to our previous chapters. And then on the east side of the Jordan, we get Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan kind of scattered there. The first one, it kind of is just north of Manasseh there. Golan on the northeast side of the map, but that is where it was located. So we can definitely see they're scattered all throughout. So of course, if you're way down in the south of Judah, you might have to race to get up to Hebron there, but otherwise, you're fairly close to one of these wherever you would be in the land. And then in chapter 21, we get towns set aside for the Levites. So the Levites are divided into these 3 groups, the Kohathites, Gershonites, and Merarites. Lots are cast, and cities from the various tribe lands are assigned to the Levites. And the key point here is that the Levites weren't isolated from everyone. Of course, they were a special tribe set aside as part of the priesthood, and they served as spiritual leaders and teachers of the time. And so they weren't isolated. They lived throughout all of the land, in and amongst the rest of the people, to serve them and guide them spiritually as they lived. And then we move on to chapter 22, our last chapter for tonight. And it starts with Joshua praising the Reubenites, Gadites, and Manassites for faithfully assisting in the campaign. They held up to what they said they were going to do. They didn't just stay at the land that they got given way back in Numbers, but they crossed the Jordan with everyone else. They got all their swords and shields ready. They went to battle and they helped the Israelites defeat the Canaanites. And now they've been released from the army to go back to their land east of the Jordan, get back to their families, get back to their livestock, so on. And when they return, they build an altar. And this kind of creates a little bit of a moment of crisis. If you've read chapter 22 and you're familiar with it, the rest of the Israelites hear about this altar and they kind of lose their mind. They're like, we're ready for war. Grab your swords. Of course, aren't we done fighting? But they're not. They grab their swords, they go, and they're like, we can't believe that you just built this altar to a false god. What are you doing? Of course, didn't God just support us through this campaign, through the claiming of the land? And they send a commission, and the Reubenites, Gadites, and Manassites explain, hey, we just built this altar as an altar of remembrance for what God has done for us, which is kind of funny because this is not the first time that we've seen this. It's not the first time that these Israelites have seen this if we go back to Joshua chapter 4, but way back in Exodus 17, Moses builds an altar of remembrance. Genesis 31, we see Jacob and Laban build a memorial as a witness to what God has done. And then in Joshua 4, as Bryce taught us several weeks ago, the Israelites, after they crossed the Jordan, carried stones out of the Jordan, built them as a memorial in remembrance of what God has done and them being delivered into the land and the crossing of the Jordan River. And so the Reubenites, Gadites, and Manassites explain, this is just for what God has done for us as a witness for future generations in order to not forget what God has done. And this altar has a name. Its name is Ed, which is the Hebrew word for witness. So that is what we have left out of chapter 22. Are there any questions or comments? Love to hear them. If not, that's our lesson for this evening. All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time and attention.